Speed is something that railways measure obsessively. It has been measured since the earliest days of steam traction, recorded in logbooks and dynamometer cars and timetables, and the competitive announcements of rival companies seeking to demonstrate their superiority over their neighbors. The history of railway performance is, in many ways, a history of speed, of the incremental and occasionally dramatic increases in what locomotives and their trains were capable of doing, measured and recorded and celebrated with a thoroughness that reflects how completely the railway industry understood velocity as the clearest possible proof of its own value. Given this obsession, the story of a locomotive that became measurably faster over 50 years of service, without anyone noticing, without any announcement or measurement or acknowledgement, is remarkable in a way that cuts against the grain of everything the railway industry believed about how it understood its own performance. The improvement happened. It was real, demonstrable, preserved in fragmentary records that were never assembled into a complete picture during the years when the locomotive was working. It was only visible in retrospect, when a historian with access to records from different periods of the locomotive's career placed them side by side and noticed something that should have been noticed decades earlier and wasn't. The locomotive was a member of the Great Eastern Railway's Y14 class, a long-lived family of small goods engines that had been introduced in 1883 by James Holden, one of the most quietly capable locomotive engineers that Victorian Britain produced. Holden had designed the Y14 with the practical wisdom of a man who understood that the locomotives most likely to succeed in long service were not the ones that pushed boundaries, but the ones that incorporated every lesson learned from previous designs into a package that was simple, robust, and easy to maintain. The Y14 was not ambitious. It was intelligent, which is a different thing and in many respects more valuable. The class was built in considerable quantity over many years, eventually reaching 289 examples and scattered across the Great Eastern Network to perform the mixed goods and light passenger work that kept the railway's freight operations functioning. They were the workhorses of the system, present everywhere and noticed nowhere, doing jobs that the express passenger engines considered beneath their dignity and that the heavy freight engines found too light to be interesting. The Y14 occupied the middle ground that most real railway work happened in, unglamorous and essential. The specific locomotive whose story this is was numbered 564 inches, the Great Eastern's fleet, and it was allocated to a goods working that connected a market town in Suffolk with the mainline junction approximately 22 miles away. The working ran 3 times a day in each direction and had done so since the branch had opened, carrying agricultural produce, coal, livestock, and the occasional passenger who found the mixed goods service more convenient than the less frequent proper passenger trains. It was exactly the kind of working that no railway journalist ever thought to observe, and that no dynamometer car ever measured. Because the question of how quickly a mixed goods train moved between a Suffolk market town and a mainline junction was not, by any conventional assessment, a question that railway performance measurement existed to answer. The records of this working that survive are fragmentary. Timetable documents from different periods show the scheduled times for the service. Working timetables, which included the more detailed timings used by operating staff, survive for some years and not others. Signalbox registers from stations along the route record the passage of trains at specific points, which allows the actual running times to be calculated for the days those registers cover. And maintenance records from the various depots that serviced Locomotive 564 over the years provide a parallel record of the locomotive's mechanical history. The historian who eventually assembled these fragments was a retired railway worker named Arthur Fielding, who had spent his working life in the Great Eastern's successor organizations, and who had developed, through decades of proximity to operational records, the particular patience that archival research requires, and the eye for anomaly that produces useful findings. Fielding was not looking for anything specific when he began working through the Suffolk branch records in the 1970s. He was assembling a general history of the branch for a local railway society publication, the kind of modest documentary project that railway history depends on volunteers to complete, because the professional academic interest is insufficient to sustain it. What he noticed several months into the work was something that he initially attributed to measurement error. The running times that could be calculated from the signalbox registers for the 1920s were slightly but consistently shorter than the running times that could be calculated from the 1890s records. Not dramatically shorter, the service was not running 20% faster. The difference was of the order of 2 to 3 minutes over a 22-mile journey, which is a difference that nobody would have noticed in the ordinary experience of using the service, and that nobody had apparently noticed in the ordinary experience of managing it. But 2 to 3 minutes over 22 miles is a real difference. It is a difference of approximately 5 to 7% in overall journey time, achieved not through a deliberate decision to accelerate the service, but through something else entirely. Fielding looked for the obvious explanations. Had the scheduled times changed? They had not. The working timetable showed the same departure and arrival times across the period, suggesting that whatever change had occurred in actual running times was not the result of a management decision to speed up the service. Had the track been improved in ways that permitted faster running? The maintenance records for the branch showed no significant upgrading that would have changed the characteristic of the route. Had the loads changed? The goods records suggested some variation, but nothing systematic enough to explain a consistent improvement across 3 decades. The explanation that Fielding eventually developed, supported by a careful reading of the maintenance records alongside the performance records, was simultaneously simple and surprising. Locomotive 564 had become faster as it aged because the wear patterns that had accumulated through decades of service had produced, in combination with the maintenance that had been applied to address those patterns, a mechanical configuration that was marginally but consistently better than the configuration the locomotive had carried when it was new. The specific mechanism was in the valve gear. The Y14 class had been designed with a valve setting that reflected Holden's design philosophy, conservative and reliable, but not optimized for maximum efficiency. The valve setting that the original design specified resulted in a slightly restricted steam flow that was appropriate for a locomotive expected to be maintained by a wide range of depot staff with varying levels of expertise. It was a setting that would produce acceptable performance across a wide range of maintenance conditions. It would not produce the best possible performance under ideal conditions, but it would produce consistent performance under the inconsistent conditions that spread across a large fleet. What had happened to Locomotive 564 over decades of service was that the wear patterns in the valve gear components had gradually shifted the effective valve setting away from the original specification toward a configuration that, by accident rather than design, produced better steam distribution than the original setting had. The changes were too small to be identified in any individual maintenance inspection. They accumulated over years and decades, each inspection finding a valve gear that was within acceptable tolerances, each inspection addressing the most obvious signs of wear while leaving in place the subtle dimensional changes that were cumulatively shifting the locomotive toward a better operating configuration. The maintenance records showed the results of this process indirectly in the pattern of minor adjustments made at each service. Over the decades, the fitters who serviced the locomotive had progressively set the valves at positions that departed slightly from the original specification. Each departure was individually minor, made in response to the specific wear condition found at that inspection, within the acceptable tolerance range of the setting procedure. Cumulatively, the departures described a drift toward a configuration that was, by the conventional measure of running time on a fixed route with consistent loads, approximately 5 to 7% better than where the locomotive had started. Fielding presented his findings at a meeting of the Railway Society that had commissioned his research, and the response was exactly what you would expect from an audience of technically knowledgeable enthusiasts. They found the finding interesting, asked several good questions about the mechanism, and then the meeting moved on to other business. The findings were published in the Society's journal in a brief article that was read by perhaps several hundred people, and that has been cited occasionally in subsequent writing about valve gear maintenance and its effects on locomotive performance. Nobody in the Great Eastern's successor organizations had noticed the improvement when it was happening. Nobody in the operational management of the branch had registered that the working was running marginally faster than it had in previous decades. Nobody in the maintenance department had understood that the progressive adjustments they were making to the valve setting were cumulatively moving the locomotive toward a better configuration. The improvement happened entirely within the space of normal operation, below the threshold of any measurement or management attention that the railway organization brought to bear on a secondary goods working on a Suffolk branch line. Locomotive 564 continued in service until 1958, when it was among the last Y14s withdrawn as the modernization program eliminated the class. It had been in service for 75 years when it was scrapped, longer than almost any other locomotive in British railway history. The running time records that survive across that 75 years show the same gradual improvement continuing into the post-war period. The locomotive becoming marginally but measurably better until the diesel replacements arrived, and the question of how quickly it could move goods from a Suffolk market town to the main line became permanently moot. The maintenance records that Fielding analyzed were themselves nearly lost. They survived in a depot archive that was cleared when the building was redeveloped in the 1960s, saved only because a clerk who was overseeing the clearance recognized that the documents were old and thought they might be of historical interest. They were deposited with a local records office that did not have the resources to properly catalogue them, where they sat in boxes for a decade before Fielding found them. The story of Locomotive 564 is not a story about engineering brilliance. It is not a story about record-breaking performance or transformative innovation. It is a story about the relationship between time and machinery, about what happens when a well-designed machine is maintained with consistent attention across decades of service. The Y14 that Holden designed in 1883 was designed to be maintainable, to be reliable, to be a machine that accumulated service rather than consumed it. The specific locomotive that Fielding studied had been maintained by dozens of fitters over 75 years, each working within the constraints of what they knew and what the equipment available to them could achieve. The improvement they collectively produced was not planned. Nobody decided that Locomotive 564 should become faster as it aged. Nobody measured the improvement as it happened. Nobody noticed it until a retired railway worker with access to fragmentary records placed those records side by side in the 1970s and saw something that had been hiding in plain sight in the accumulated decades of documented service. The locomotive that became faster as it aged teaches something about the nature of improvement that planned improvement rarely demonstrates. Not all progress is the product of intention. Not all improvement is the result of decisions made by people who understood that they were improving something. Sometimes things get better through the accumulated effect of ordinary attention, applied consistently across time through the unplanned alignment of small adjustments that were each made for their own specific reason, but that together described a direction that nobody had chosen. The railway industry measures speed obsessively. It measured everything about Locomotive 564 except the thing that happened to it across 50 years of daily service. The improvement was real. It ran through every working day, expressed in 2 to 3 minutes, shaved from a 22-mile goods journey, witnessed by no one and noticed by no one, until a retired clerk sat in an archive in the 1970s and asked what the numbers meant. They meant that time had made something better without anyone asking it to.